name is Bhargavi, and happy to meet you all virtually like this. And it's a great initiative that has been put together by CFA. Since we were all home under the lockdown and having multiple conversations between ourselves, we thought we should put this together. And it's a great privilege for me to be here to introduce to you all our speaker for the day, Mr. Gautam Mody, and also moderate the session. This is the first of the series of the webinar called the Solidarity Series, and it has been titled Conversations During Lockdown and Beyond. So the webinar session for today is titled Capitalism in Times of Corona. So as we all know, the coronavirus pandemic has become a serious public health threat across the world, and human suffering caused by it is definitely very enormous, much more than anybody had imagined. In countries of the global south, where public health systems are very fragile and health systems have been undermined by the neoliberal policies, the implications will be very serious on lives and livelihoods. The uncertainty of the current crisis has left governments, corporations, financial institutions, civil society, and practically everyone very worried, as when all of us are home and stop going out of our homes, or when people don't have money to spend, the circulation of money comes to a grinding halt. So with COVID-19, it will probably change the way in which money flows post this lockdown and probably even post 2020. Because if you follow the disease path, it has followed the path of global capitalism, trade, travel, the business routes. And as it moved in these paths, it has destroyed the economy all over. So the question remains, will this little virus be a great lesson to capitalism? Will the rules of the game become fairer post this? Who will make these rules? Who will benefit? Who will lose? Or will it create a path for workers to organize, mobilize, and work in just and fair conditions? Or will it also make way for a completely new economic beginning with reduced dependence on global capitalism and revitalize local economies in times of climate change? So these are some of the questions that's probably haunting all of us. And the right person to address these is Mr. Gautam Mody. Mr. Gautam Mody, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today, and thank you for making time. And you're the right person to throw some light on these questions and in the times of the corona pandemic. So to introduce him and share a little bit about him, Mr. Gautam Mody is the General Secretary of the New Trade Union Initiative of India. He was with the Kamani Employees Union in Mumbai. NTUI was formed when several independent trade unions in the organized and unorganized sector came together under the banner of the New Trade Union Initiative in 2001. Its core constituent is the National Center for Labor, a trade union of informal sector workers. It has built a democratic organization that now represents more than 1 million workers, with a special emphasis on informal workers. So over to Mr. Gautam Mody, but just a little bit on the format of today's session. So the webinar will be for an hour. Mr. Mody will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and we will open the floor for question and answers. If you want to ask a question or make a point, Zoom has a button to raise your hands, or you can also add your name in the chat box, and we will let you ask the question. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking, and also please keep your cell phones on silent mode. Thank you, everyone, and over to Mr. Mody.
Bhargavi, my name is Gautam. Well, I'm grateful to the Center for Financial Accountability for putting this together. if I can also bring in a rule which Vijayan will object to, I think this should be a no smoking forum. You could turn off your camera. I wouldn't be able to see you, Vijayan. Anyway, I'm hoping that the questions Bhargavi has raised are questions we will be able to answer in the course of this series and beyond. I don't believe I have answers to any of the questions she's raised. I've come onto this forum more to deal with more questions I have. Let me sort of put the situation we're in the context of the global economy. We were told that before the coronavirus began its spread at the start of the year, we were told by the International Monetary Fund that we were on the edge of a global recession. But I think in a sense, there are 8 aspects to what have happened to the world in the last 10 years. 4 are very clear outcomes of the global crisis, and the other 4, the effect it's had in a larger sense, both quite beyond both preceding and after the global crisis. And I just want to flag these as markers of where we stand in the globe today. First, global production in 2018 did not return to pre-crisis 2008 levels. Second, global trade did not return to pre-crisis levels. Third, bond markets and stock markets grew from $15 trillion in 2008 to $33 trillion in 2018, so they more than doubled. And world travel increased from 800 million a year, 800 million people traveling from one country to another, to 1.4 billion between 2008 and 2008. So on the one hand, we have both production and trade not actually quite recovering, but we have financialization more than doubling, and global travel nearly doubling. With this, I think there are 2 inescapable realities. First, the pandemic that we know as COVID-19 unambiguously has its origins in the human race's interaction with the non-human, suggested primarily animals, both wild and domesticated, but possibly other parts of nature. Second, most recently as 2018, but several times before and in various forms thereafter, in 2018, the WHO warned the world of epidemic X. Third, and in a way, a byproduct of the first of the first 4 set of outcomes following the global crisis, we've seen global spending on medicines, especially on public medicine and universal access to healthcare decline in general, a decline in social security and social protection expenditures. And of course, with it, we've seen an increasing in the financialization of economies, particularly with the use of very soft monetary instruments by advanced economies, and a pressure from them on developing and emerging economies to financialize further, while in turn forsaking more of their policy autonomy. So in a sense, where do we, we find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, which Bhargavi rightly said has a huge public health consequence. I'm not going to deal with the immediate public health consequence. I believe there are going to be people in this series who are more competent than I to talk on it. So what finally is capitalism? Capitalism is that system of organizing economy where circulation and accumulation of money in search of profits passes through relations of production, distribution, and accumulation, of course conditioned by social relationships of community, of household, of community, and of countries to create the situation that we're in. What does the profit system then do, or the capitalist system then do in a situation like this? I mean, very broadly, there are two very clear and direct fallouts. In terms of right-wing economics, there's what they call an income effect and a wealth effect. There's a reduction, there's an immediate lockdown, which results in, as we can see, people out of work, people out of wages, and therefore people not able to meet their basic needs, in short, not able to consume. That in a sense is the income effect, the loss of income. What that then translates into is affects people's assets. Sorry, did somebody want to come in? Okay. What that then translates into in the medium term, which in our context we could start seeing very quickly, the medium term could begin between 3 to 6 months from now, where people start actually selling their assets in order to survive, and those assets pass from a poorer section of society to a richer or relatively richer section of society. So broadly, I think this is the challenge that we face. This is clearly, one looks at the way the world transformed post the global crisis. We've witnessed increases in inequality that are quite unparalleled, and as is being suggested, increases in inequality that take us back almost a century. What this is likely to do is accentuate that. So we're likely to end up in a world that is more unequal than it is today, as we see tens of millions of people out of work in the short term, but very large numbers also in the long term. We are going to witness in the course of the coming months capital adjusting to looking at a world which would in fact mean fewer jobs to do the same work. If you think about, just try and think through what work at home is doing. Work at home is actually giving capital the opportunity to think, what is it that they don't need people for? There are companies that must be, there's already sort of, if you go into the business websites, you'll find that they're wargaming the future scenario. The future scenario includes, how do you do with fewer people? How do you automate some operations? Even in what are merely even in what would be called manual work, janitorial services, capital will be looking at how they could do with fewer people. We know from workplaces that have been reduced to skeletal workforces that even janitorial staff has been reduced in very large numbers. Security staff has been reduced. It would be argued right now that they're not required because the establishment is shut, so it's just a maintenance operation. Now it's a question of capital and employers rethinking what is it that we can do without, how do we make X worker doing Y job do it better, but what's most important, do it faster, do it more intensively. Put in more intensively means put in more sweat, so to speak. This is, in very, very simple terms, a transformation that we sit on the cusp of. And this transformation will be heightened as we go through the coming months. We're likely to see, if one sort of thinks about it, the disappearing of a large number of small establishments that continue to provide and serve both our rural and urban spaces. I mean, it's interesting that if one looks at how the economy is functioning, the economy is being held up today to the extent that it is, in terms of basic necessities, by the old brick and mortar economy, by the old brick and mortar supply chain, be it grain merchants, be it grocers, be it vegetable sellers. The grand new world of digital has actually completely and entirely collapsed. As we see it here in India, of course, it's different in other parts of the world, but you know, there's actually been a significant collapse of the digital world. In a sense, two things emerge over here. One, of course, the fact that the brick and mortar economy was functioning as a result of digital at much lower levels of capacity, and therefore, in a way, it has been able to replace the digital world with that excess capacity very quickly. Conversely, the digital world operates at very thin margins at a very high level of capacity utilization, or relatively high level of capacity utilization, and the surge in demand because of lockdowns actually resulted in resulted in a complete collapse of that system. But there's really more to it than the collapse of the digital economy than we can immediately put our finger on. But when the post-pandemic restructuring takes place, capital is going to plug the gaps, the errors, the collapses, so to speak, in the digital economy, and seek to improve on it to ensure that this kind of collapse does not happen, which then necessarily means transferring more jobs to within a centralized framework, but correspondingly also to fewer jobs, replacing them with automation, replacing them with artificial intelligence. I mean, this is an inescapable logic that the big five tech firms and everyone that connects with that world, both commercially and technology, will be looking for and stepping into. Bhargavi, I was supposed to speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and I can't actually see my clock on the phone, so you'll have to.
You have another 8-9 minutes. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, my clock has completely disappeared, which is probably a good thing. Yeah. So this is I think a situation that we should be worried about. This is a situation we should be concerned about. I want to look at a couple of examples of somewhere where this transformation may occur. And they don't augur very well for our society. The one thing that has disappeared quite significantly across the world and has completely disappeared in vast parts of our country is the newspaper. I don't think that's a development that is the physical newspaper. I don't think that's a development I would treat very lightly. Within the logic of capital, there has been a balance of force where the print media has so far relatively been more independent of capital than the non-print media. And this is really a, sorry, I didn't get you. Sorry, was somebody trying to say something?
Is that
okay?
You have something to say? Oh, I think you can continue. Sorry.
All right. The print media has been, in relative terms, less dominated by the forces of capital and the forces of far right-wing politics than the non-print media, especially the television media. And this is something which can be said not just for our country, but many other parts of the world, where we're seeing the rise of the new right. Are we going to be able to see a complete revival of the newspaper as we understand it? Or is the newspaper going to move to a digital format that opens up for greater degrees of control?
So sorry about that.
No, that's okay. These are, I can see there are a very large number of people on board, and I think it's quite an achievement to have got so many people on board and be able to conduct this in this manner. I'm sure things will improve as we get along with this medium, but I am nervous about this medium. Second, the entire process of so-called social distancing. It's not quite social distancing. The word, it should have been physical distancing as opposed to social distancing. Presumes a certain sort of capacity of society. This in a way, one wants to think about it in a large corporate sense or government sense. It begins with the idea of quote unquote working from home, but if one takes it all the way down to how society and politics is organized, it's finally organized around meetings, it's finally organized around people coming together in public action, and I think these are important questions we must ask ourselves at this juncture, and not assume that we will get back to business as usual as we know it. These are most certainly two things that concern me and concern me quite significantly. I think with that, I would come back to the question of what my concerns would be of what happens to jobs, what happens to the economy, and what therefore happens as a result to society and democracy. In that sense, should concern us both directly and indirectly. We would be failing in our sense of looking at the medium and long-term questions that in one form or another may result or will result in a transformation of society. I'll probably stop here and then come back if there are questions or comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Gautam. Thank you so much. You kind of highlighted some very key issues, and it kind of has resonated with all of us, I'm sure, especially this whole the digital collapse, the working from home. And I'm sure each of us are thinking in our own circles of how many of us will even hold on to the jobs that we have. Uh, and the disappearance of the newspapers, the freedom of the media, the social versus physical. I'm sure our participants here have a whole lot of questions. So we would look forward to their questions for more richer discussions. Please raise your hand or you can chat. Yeah, Vijayan?
No, thanks, Gautam. It was quite intense. It was quite an interesting topic to pick on, capitalism and Corona. Just two quick questions, and Bhargavi, can I ask them in a row?
Sure, sure.
Okay. So the first is, one line of argument has always been about the 2008 model of recession was that the agricultural economies are, in a certain sense, largely spared from that spiraling of the recession, the downturn that happened. Even around this time in the global recession conversations, this was something that was jetting out, that how will the agricultural economies respond vis-a-vis the other economies, which are either industrial or techno-based economies now. So in the wake of Corona having furthered this recession that has been in the offing, where do we put this question of agricultural economies versus other economies? The second is, does it matter to capitalism to investigate whose virus this is? Because one set of whole theorizations that you see around the globe is either it's a Chinese virus or is it an American bio virus. Whose capitalism is going to last? That's it.
Was agriculture not affected by the 2008 crisis? Was agriculture actually not a contributor to the 2008 crisis? Commodity prices were on the rise through the 2000s. There are two or three very, just looking at it from the ground, from our perspective, from the perspective of a country like ours, a country in the global south, there are at the very least two things that happen to agriculture. First, we're already hearing of the inability to actually lift the standing crop, for the lack of availability of harvesters where mechanization has happened. And we have to recognize that there's a fairly extensive use of the mechanical form in our agriculture today. Because of the unplanned nature of the lockdown, and you can't get away from it, we know of the vast volume of fish, vegetables, etc., which have been dumped and not. So that's an immediate loss that has occurred, and that's obviously going to affect incomes and assets. But the effect that's going to immediately very quickly start feeding into the system is with the unbelievably large number of migrants that drive the urban economy. The suggestions are as many as 1 in 4, or at the very least 1 in 5 workers in this country is a migrant. As migrant workers return to their villages without that 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 rupees a month flowing in, they are going to drive agricultural wages down. They will seek agricultural work for want of any other. We already have a system where the agricultural wage almost tends to zero. That's of course incorrect, But the agricultural wage today, one can say reasonably, is well below the sustenance wage, and it's other forms of rural work that actually allow for sustenance. So we're going to see a very, very sharp sort of decline, so to speak, in agriculture. There's no getting away from it. The pandemic, as far as India is concerned, could not have come at a worse time. The economy has been mismanaged. The economy has been completely grounded. We all recognize that the crisis of the Indian economy was a crisis of demand. And what lockdown does is bring that demand down to zero, bring that demand to essentials, and only those who can afford essentials. There are large numbers of people who are going to be forsaking the very basics that they could have afforded. And so agriculture is actually going to play a very, very crucial and critical part in completely locking down the economy. Reviving the economy, I think, is going to, agriculture is again going to have to be at the center of it. You know, I've read a bit about the who caused the virus. I'm not sure I'm competent to get into that debate. I've read a bit around, not quite understood too much of it. And I think it's speculative at this point to suggest whose capitalism is going to survive. I think the one capital we know that is going to survive is going to be a highly financialized capital. If we don't want it to be that way, then we are going to have to look at more aggressive ways, more militant ways to defend our democracies, our political systems, our political institutions, and very, very critically, in defending our political institutions, the right to our freedom of association, and therefore our right to form and join trade unions and any other association would be central to it.
Yeah. Thank you, Gautam. I cannot see the entire gallery. I can only see one section of it. So I would encourage our participants to put your questions on chat. We have a bunch of questions here. I will read it out because to save time.
I'm actually seeing them over here.
Okay. So should we take the question from Maju?
Oh, okay. You know, Maju, I'm not sure globalization and the rise of the right are in a way, they're not so straightforward to say that they're counterposing with each other. Globalization, sorry, the rise of the new right survives as a result, or the rise of the new right is the result of global, of imperialist globalization. It's in fact the mutation of neoliberalism for the survival of capitalism, if I can put it that way. Obviously, there are, you know, there are tensions, and now this is the question of, you know, how the world is going to reorder. How much of, you know, one thing that's certainly been undermined significantly, and the other thing that has not been undermined, and I think we need to take note of that. The trade in, you know, if you go back to where I started, trade in goods declined 2008 to 2018, or what the collapse that occurred in 2008 has not been recovered by 2018. While global trade in financial instruments has more than doubled. Now, the world is ground to a halt, but the stock markets and the currency markets are still going. And before I agree, before, you know, yesterday in the course of the last 36 hours, I called several friends who are economists by profession, who teach, who write, who research, well-known names, and they all agreed that the stock market should be shut. But the fact is the stock market is going on. And now the right wing has two arguments for why the stock market should be open, each more facetious than the other. The first, that what need not be shut down should not be shut down. I mean, that's really sort of a baseless argument. Second, that given that the stock market can function virtually, it's very important to get the data. Data for what? Data for whom? So we have a situation where we have mass unemployment, we have mass wagelessness, we have mass economic and social disturbance at catastrophic levels, amounting to unbelievable humanitarian disaster. But you can still speculate in the market. You can still buy and sell stock. So that part of globalization is alive and kicking, and that part of globalization is central to the new right as much as it was as it was to neoliberalism. So it's the survival of financialization and capital that I think in a way is being asserted right now above everything else. If I'm getting them in order, Junaid, would there be an impact on the idea of access to public health? I think that's for us to bring out. Spain, these are just I'm just cherry picking here. Spain has actually nationalized the entire public health system. If you're following reports, some of our relatively more progressive state governments, I use the word relative, caps, bolds, and all screaming, governments in Rajasthan, the governments in Andhra Pradesh, have actually chartered the entire health system, private health system, and brought it under some kind of state control right now. So yes, this is, I think, a debate we need to bring up. We need to bring up the entire question of public purpose, dealing with the entire framework of, and I deliberately used the three words production, distribution, and consumption. We need to bring that entire framework within a sense of public interest and the public purpose. Otherwise, we'd be really failing in looking at how we deal with this crisis and crisis in the future. Leo lives in a village outside Bangalore. I didn't know that, Leo. I think you're absolutely right. We are actually dealing with the tyranny of the market, because the market is deciding, in a sense, what we need to receive and what not. We are, as I said, possibly we're entering a phase where we're going to see greater control of the market and greater control, especially of the financial markets, over economy and society. So I don't think what you're suggesting is at all naive.
Shailesh?
The one thing that we've certainly seen through financialization is the lot of is a loss of sovereignty of governments. We've seen the loss of sovereignty, especially of governments in the global south, resulting in actually 3, 4, 5 governments of the global north acquiring power. Sailesh's question is really where we go from here. And yes, how do we deal with the question of production? How do we deal with the question of substitution of where production currently takes place? This is for the progressive movement to lead. This is not going to happen organically. corporates are just waiting how they can get the supply chain back. In Karnataka, our affiliate, the Garment and Textile Workers Union, sort of in the run up to the 24th, there were districts under lockdown, but garment factory owners, the big garment factory owners, managed to get the lockdown lifted for their factories, forcing workers back. So we're going to, after the 14th of April, and I think we can be reasonably certain, we're not going to see an extension of the lockdown beyond the 14th of April, because it's going to it's already testing the capacity of our own indigenous capital, the big indigenous capital, and they going to want to get their factories back to work. This is, how are we going to deal with the question of self-sufficiency? How are we going to deal with, these are questions of self-sufficiency and self-reliance, which are in a way finally about sovereignty. Yes, of course, this is a terrible time, Sushant. It couldn't have come at a worse time for the Indian economy, but I'm not so sure the government has the capacity to deal with this kind of situation. If the economy was in a better shape, would we have been able to deal with it better? That's not very clear to me. But I can say that it's certainly going to result in a much worse situation than anybody could have imagined, or we could imagine in the future. Anil, I don't think there will be a mode of struggle specific to India. I can say this, there are already strikes. There's a strike being called in the United States today. It's not yet quite morning, but the vast number of e-businesses are going to experience strikes, Amazon, etc., over safety and working conditions of people in the economy that are being overworked, that are being overstretched and completely unprotected. Similarly, there have been strikes called by unions in Italy. In northern Italy, the part of Italy that's most affected by the pandemic, on conditions of work. There are serious questions that are being raised repeatedly and everywhere about conditions of work of health workers. I think we're not doing enough of that at home. We have been on the ground and we've tried to put out posters, videos on workers working without any kind of protection. I think this is what needs to get out. Who are the workers? This, there's a speech of Jeremy Corbyn making the rounds in the British House of Commons, in which he says, give them respect. This is a time a hedge fund manager or a CEO, they're sitting at home and working from home. It's finally the health workers, the janitors, the workers on power lines, the sanitation workers who are still out there. And in our society and our economy, they're out there without protective gear. They're out there without even basic forms of health and safety equipment. So I think this is definitely something to mobilize on, but I would not, I'm not going to speculate on whether we'd be able to do this more or less. Would this have an impact on the banking sector? Yes, it will have an impact on every sector.
Gautam, sorry to interrupt. Did we take Priya's question?
Have I missed Priya? No, I think I missed that.
Yeah, it's above Sushant's question.
Sorry, you went.
I'm so sorry.
Yes, I think it's going to provide them with an excuse. This morning's news, as I saw it, suggesting that possibly the community transmission in our country is originating at a certain mosque. It's frightening news. These people are going to try and ride on it. So it couldn't have come at a worse time for them to get away with it, but it's almost like they went down, hunting down mosques and seeing if they could locate it. We have, as everybody on this group, I'm sure, who's out here this morning knows, we have extremely low levels of testing, shockingly low levels of testing. There's no way one can claim, given the levels of testing, that it all came through one mosque.
Yeah.
So I think when I say that, when we defend the economy, we need to defend society and democracy too, and it's really fighting the new right. I think to me, these are all linked and very, very important. I don't think there's, sorry, have I answered that satisfactorily? Does somebody have questions at this point, or should I just keep going with questions?
That question was Priya's, so probably I would request her to chat again based on your response to her. So in the meantime, maybe you could take Bindu's question. Bindu has 2 questions.
I don't think we're in a position to, India doesn't have anything like a rate of unemployment or underemployment as far as I'm concerned. To the extent that the vast part of this country is dependent on agriculture, or employment is dependent on agriculture, and we know that agriculture cannot create full employment by any measure or in any sense. Actually, a very large number of people in this country at any time, at the best of times, are underemployed. So we're today looking at levels of unemployment and underemployment that are simply incalculable, not us. We do not have actually a method of calculating underemployment that is at all satisfactory. LPG maybe not. We may not face a shortage because we actually have a fairly extensive system of gas pipelines. This is piped. It's very low on the use of labor, except on the delivery, the last mile. The public sector oil companies have gas filling stations that are fairly decentralized. So no, I don't see an immediate crisis in what's coming on in terms of LPG. But I think there are other crises that are probably already happening and we haven't yet fully heard of them, and I imagine we'll hear about them in the next few days. I think there will be a crisis of lentils, of dal. That's a very important part of the Indian diet, and there is not enough indication to suggest that there are stockpiles of dals in FCI godowns. We do know that there are stockpiles of dals of wheat and rice, but yeah.
Ashwin?
Yeah. In terms of resurgence of the natural world, clouded over skies with pollution obviously harm the poor. But the wonderful clear skies that we even see in Delhi these days are not in any way going to benefit the poor. They are not going to benefit a more progressive, egalitarian, and just society unless we can alter the relations of production, distribution, and consumption. Just having a clean environment is not going to, at today's level of inequality and distribution, going to result in a better world for the more disadvantaged. It will, yes, save them from some of the floods, etc., but it will not, in and of itself, make a significant improvement. That's my sense of it. I'm sure there would be others. There would be environmentalists who would argue against me, but my sense is we must address the question of redistribution and social justice. They go along with a habitable planet.
Nupur, and question?
Yes, I wonder how the capacity on our food security is going to pan out. There's going to be more demand for basics. There's going to be more pressure on land. There are going to be more people back in the countryside for and we're going to be running down food stocks. So in general, there's, I think, going to be a challenge on our food security.
Joe, and then
yeah, there's just one thing that I thought I missed out over there. There was a reference to something about, yes, I mean, a lot of food has already been lost, and yes, you mentioned poultry. That's what I thought I had missed out. I mean, we've heard that chicken is being sold at 30 rupees a kilo. I haven't yet been able to find chicken at 30 rupees a kilo, but from the industry side, and it's a very powerful lobby, the poultry lobby in our country, they put out news days before the lockdown that so many thousands of crores of rupees worth of poultry had been lost because the BJP RSS, of course they didn't say that, the BJP RSS had put out rumors that COVID came to people who were meat eaters and COVID could be fought by a healthy vegetarian diet. So yes, there are whole swaths of the primary economy that have already been destroyed. We are not able to actually at this point estimate what the extent of that loss is, but I think we can be reasonably certain that this damage will not be easy to come back from. That said, I think we also must reflect on our poultry industry. Our poultry industry represents, in a way, India's highest end of engagement with biotech and with bioengineering. We haven't really got into that scale of, biotech and bioengineering with other animals as we have with poultry. Even in the course of my lifetime, the real price of chicken has actually declined and become more affordable than it was 35 or 40 years ago. So it's something to the rise of the broiler is part of this. So if we're talking about unfolding and looking at self-sufficiency and self-reliance, I think we would also have to unwind our poultry economy to a more organic and a more ecologically sustainable one. These questions are coming thick and fast.
Given the time, we will take these three questions from Joe, Rajesh, and Neeraj, and then see how much time we will still be left with. Yeah.
$136 million jobs are at risk. I suspect the number in reality may be very much more. The question about privatization or rather nationalization. Yes, Spain has nationalized its health service. But if one looks at what happened to nationalization post the global crisis, it was really using public resources to shore up private businesses, private institutions, until such time as they could be handed back. Brings out the limitations of privatization absolutely and unambiguously. But unless we're able to make an ideological shift in how the privatization model has failed and build a groundswell of support for that, and that includes building strong militant unions and every other kind of strong and militant civil society organization, Joe, I don't see us being able to unfold and revive this. I saw on one of the many groups that we are all members of this morning or yesterday, of how 30 private sector banks have collapsed in the country over the last 30 years. The reality still is that's still the ideological barometer is the private sector is better than the public sector, is more efficient than the public sector. We have not been able to win this argument of efficiency, and I think we have to face it. We're correct where we stand, but we're not able to win the argument. We're not able to move people on the battle against privatization. For the most part, in India, the battle against privatization is being fought by that section of workers that is directly affected. So it's privatization of banks, it's then bank workers who come out in defense of it. If it's privatization of the petroleum companies, it's petroleum workers who are fighting it. We've not been able to make this an issue, and I think this represents a failure or a weakness of the progressive movement. And that's something we really have to address head on.
Yeah, so we have a question from Rajesh and Neeraj. So those came in pretty earlier. We could take those two and maybe wrap up.
Yeah, in fact, the question from Neeraj is the most profound. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. How is this going to affect global medicine and medical markets? World is at a funny place. Why did the research on SARS and on a vaccine for SARS and for MERS, why did that work stop? That work stopped because those epidemics subsided, remained relatively localized, and there was no need for it, or no strong need for it. The fact is, global pharma companies are not interested in vaccinations. They're not interested in prevention. They would rather engage in curative medication, which gives them continuous profits. This brings out the complete absence of public investment in healthcare, in health research, in public medicine, in vaccinations. Even today, I mean, there is some kind of a public-private fund group. I forget the exact name. It's a Helsinki-based global effort in which governments have contributed very small amounts of money in terms of research. Dr. Gagandeep Kang of CMC Vellore recently said, a vaccine would require $2 billion. I don't know, I presume that's a computed figure. I don't take what she says lightly. But that $2 billion is not there. In the meantime, you have the President of the United States trying to buy out a German company, or better still, buy out the chief executive of a German company and make off with a drug which he thinks he will protect the United States with. So it's certainly going to reshape, I think, global pharma in a way where global pharma is, for the first time in a very long time, perhaps since the start of the last century, since they had to deal with malaria, smallpox, etc., probably put its money in a vaccine and move some of their money away from curative to preventive cures that may, in some part, transform the global pharma industry. But I don't see how that's going to improve or change conditions for workers. I think the impact in the pharma industry will probably be that which workers face elsewhere. I think the big question is, what are workers in healthcare, actually in delivery of healthcare, going to face? That is going to be that's going to be a central challenge of how they're protected, how they're secured. Yep.
Question from Neeraj.
Yeah, that's a much larger question. It goes a question that predates the pandemic. Yes, I think unions have a role to play. Unions have a role to play in evolving what's an acceptable green transition, which would move to non-renewables, but also recognize that non-renewables are not the only answer, and non-renewables have their own problems, and not one size fits all. But absolutely, unions do have to play an important part in working with their membership on a green transition, including moving out of coal, and in ensuring that there is an acceptable dividend in terms of jobs, in terms of continuity employment, in terms of reskilling, so on and so forth. These are questions, I think, that unions should be addressing, are addressing in some ways, but perhaps not sufficiently.
Yeah, I think Jal has a very interesting point to make, where he shares about the bonding between the near and dear ones, and the opportunity for youth and women and indigenous people to come together and to form local and global business centers and units. And he also adds a little further that I saw something where he says we will leave without, I thought I saw something. Yeah, so maybe it'll be good if you can kind of respond to that, because then it will leave us all with something positive to go back and engage with and think about this in a positive way.
I mean, I think there can't but be a positive way to look at it. How are we going to respond to this crisis? It's early days yet. There are some people who already believe it's lost. I think it's not something to be pessimistic about. We have to find ways to regroup. What is being suggested by isolating and holding migrant workers captive is saying you can stay well by not going back to your families. That's completely unacceptable. I think people have every right to go back, and I think when the process of coming back together, of putting the economy back together, we're going to see a migration in different forms, at different pace, at a different scale. Our movement has to be ready and willing to go back to its own people, its own membership in the case of the trade union during this crisis, in order to deal with it actively, engage with it actively, but also when the economy revives. I think these are going to be very important. And yes, if we do believe another world is possible, that other world is going to be built by the next generation, as it is in every generation. And it is going to be built by the next generation of women, of those who are historically disadvantaged and discriminated, of those who are at the margins of society. They are going to be the ones who are going to build the new world, as we have done century after century. We are in the short run going to have to look at new forms of communication. I think all of us in the mass movement are already doing that, and that's something which I believe is going to help us foster our organizations, grow them stronger, and grow them bigger. And that's how, in a way, I think we will be able to answer just about all the questions that came in this morning.
Thank you so much, Gautam. And I would like to thank everybody who participated here, and special thanks to those beautiful comments towards the end. So Vijayan says, Kovastic way, and Leo says it's better than sitting and watching Ramayana and Mahabharata, certainly. So thanks everybody, and I'm sure we all have some very thought-provoking ideas, and we are all going to engage in our own little circles in a very meaningful way to address this situation, do our little bit to help in whatever way possible. Thank you very much.
I just want to thank everyone. Very large number of people came together, and I want to thank the CFA for this very important initiative, and I hope it contributes to our rethinking of where we go from here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to our moderator.